Gregory and Margaret had been together for over 2 decades, a stretch of time that brought them 3 kids, a loyal dog, and a warm, lived-in house tucked away in the countryside. They'd said their vows just as they were stepping into their 30s, a decision that, at the time, felt steady, well-considered, and adult in every way. Still, not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Gregory's mother, in particular, had been dead set against the union. She never held back, always nudging him, sometimes gently, sometimes not, to look for someone more suitable. Margaret never quite won her over. No matter how hard she tried, her mother-in-law remained cool, often voicing her doubts and tossing around ominous warnings like, "You'll regret this someday." But after their first child arrived, the tension between the two women slowly eased. With the baby in the picture, Gregory's mother softened, finally beginning to accept Margaret, if not with open arms, then at least without constant scorn. Deep down, maybe there'd been a kernel of truth in the old woman's doubts, but Gregory wasn't willing to go there. He shut that door and kept it locked. Funny enough, just days before the wedding, Gregory had walked in on something that would have made most grooms second-guess everything. He'd opened a door to find Margaret in a private conversation with another man. Not just any man, either. The guy was the host and organizer of their wedding. When Gregory asked what was going on, Margaret had quickly explained they were finalizing some last-minute details and working on a surprise for the big day. It sounded plausible enough, and Gregory, unwilling to create a scene so close to the altar, swallowed his unease and let it go. He chose trust over turmoil, at least back then. Over the years, Margaret had carved out a career in design, landing a solid job at a respected company. That opportunity had come through a mutual friend, Nicholas, who had long been impressed by her skills. He'd put in a good word with the higher-ups, and just like that, she was in. Margaret never stopped being grateful. She knew she'd been given a real shot at something good. Then one afternoon, Gregory, out on a casual errand, unexpectedly ran into Nicholas at a mall. It was the middle of a weekday, so the timing was a little odd. Nicholas suggested they catch up over coffee, and they ended up chatting for hours at a small cafe just around the corner. The conversation eventually drifted toward work, and Nicholas started talking about a particularly demanding project their team was working on. That's when he dropped a name Gregory wasn't expecting to hear. "Yeah, Margaret's been tackling it with our top guy, Victor," Nicholas said, sipping his espresso. "Victor? Wait, you mean that Victor? Is he with you guys?" Gregory asked, his voice suddenly sharper. Nicholas nodded. "He's been with us for a couple of years now." Gregory's blood ran cold. For a moment, he just stared, his face draining of color, then, just as fast, it flushed red. His jaw clenched tight. So Margaret had been working side by side with the very man who, once upon a time, had nearly torn their marriage apart, and for over 2 years? Not only that, but they were leading projects together? He could barely think straight. The anger hit him like a wave, hot and wild. By the time he got home, his nerves were frayed, and he was itching for answers. He waited in silence, pacing. As soon as Margaret walked through the door, he stepped out from the hallway, his face dark with tension. She blinked at him, startled. "What's going on?" Gregory didn't respond right away. He took a breath, trying to gather his thoughts. Then, with unsettling calm, he told her he knew about Victor. Margaret froze for just a second, just enough to give something away. "So what?" she said, trying to play it cool. "We're just co-workers." Yeah, right. That was the story she'd rehearsed, no doubt. But ever since Victor had resurfaced, they'd been more than just colleagues. There was something between them, something unspoken, something hidden, a secret neither of them dared to say out loud. And now it hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Margaret kept her expression steady, doing her best to act unbothered. She answered his questions without cracking, careful not to give him any real reason to doubt her. But Gregory wasn't buying it. Every word she spoke just made his anger simmer hotter. Still, what could he do? He had no proof. Nothing concrete, only a gut feeling that something was off. All he could do was choose, believe her or don't. A few weeks passed. That night marked a silent turning point in their marriage. An invisible line had been drawn between them. Though they continued to live under the same roof, share meals, and maintain a facade of normalcy for their children, something fundamental had shifted. Trust, once the quiet backbone of their relationship, had fractured. And even though Gregory had chosen to stay, it didn't mean he had truly forgiven her. He observed Margaret with a different gaze, now measured, distant, as if trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the stranger he never truly knew. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, when her laugh or the way she tucked her hair behind her ear would remind him of the early days, the days when he believed in the story they were writing together. But now, that story felt more like a half-truth. Margaret, for her part, did her best to regain his trust, though she knew better than to push. The weight of guilt hung over her, but she also carried a quiet resolve to make things right or at least bear the consequences with dignity. She no longer met with Victor, even professionally. She handed off projects, avoided company events, and made sure her time was spent at home. Their youngest daughter, Emma, remained blissfully unaware of the storm her parents were weathering. Gregory clung to her laughter, her school stories, her drawings left on the fridge. Those were his anchors. They were what kept him from walking out the door on nights when the pain crept too close. As months passed, the sharpness of betrayal dulled, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance. Gregory no longer expected answers from Margaret. He had stopped trying to understand the why. Instead, he focused on what he could still control: being a good father, maintaining the home, keeping the peace. Whether that made him weak or strong, he didn't know. But he knew he was needed. And sometimes, being needed was enough to keep a man standing, even when his heart had long since sat down. Would you like to continue this story or explore how it unfolds after Emma turns 18? As expected, no miracle came. The distance between Gregory and Margaret didn't heal with time, it only grew deeper. Over the next 4 years, things didn't just stagnate. They quietly unraveled. What had once been an uncomfortable silence became an unbearable weight. The unresolved tension lingered in every room, like a storm cloud that never quite broke, but never left either. When their children eventually moved out, heading off to college and carving out their own paths, something shifted. For the first time in years, neither Gregory nor Margaret felt obligated to keep up the charade. They no longer had to tiptoe around unspoken resentments or perform the roles of devoted partners. There was, strangely, a mutual sense of relief. The mask had slipped, and underneath it, neither of them felt inclined to pick it back up. Margaret moved out almost immediately, leaving behind the remnants of their life together and settling in with Victor. Gregory stayed in the apartment, now too quiet, too tidy but undeniably his. They filed the divorce paperwork without fanfare, and within weeks, their marriage was legally behind them. No tears, no drama, just a quiet end to something that had already died a long time ago. To Gregory's own surprise, what followed wasn't sorrow but something closer to peace. The constant undercurrent of tension that had defined his life for years evaporated. It was like stepping into fresh air after being trapped in a smoky room. The silence of his apartment no longer felt oppressive, it felt clean, freeing. For the first time in decades, he could breathe. Now and then, he and Margaret would bump into each other at birthdays, school recitals, family dinners. The venom that once tinged their interactions had faded. They no longer saw each other as adversaries, just as people who had once shared a long, complicated chapter. Oddly enough, a kind of gentle camaraderie settled between them. They spoke like distant friends, not with warmth, perhaps, but with understanding. They had both weathered the storm, and though their ships had taken different directions, they could now wave to each other from across the waters, hopeful that at last they might each find their own version of happiness.